Well, hello everyone, this is Mel here, the founder of Origins, formerly known as Sneakers Corner. Can you guess where I am? I'm here for a conversation. Let's get moving here for a second. Let's see if we can figure out where we are. Let's have a look. Speaker's Corner. And who should we have here to talk to but the main man himself?
Welcome to London, Mel.
Yeah. Cheers. You're having a nice cup of coffee?
Yeah, there's nothing more English than having a cup of tea in the rain.
Okay, so Paul,
Yes.
we've been looking at a lot of holes in the narratives over the last few months. I suppose the big ones are the issue of Mecca and the fact that Mecca doesn't show up till
Yes.
very late. I think that's something we'd agree on, that Mecca is
I think pretty much
concept.
everyone who looks at it now agrees that there's no Mecca. There's not a single shred of evidence to say that Mecca exists. Not a mention in a document, not a coin, not a shard of pottery. Absolutely zero evidence of Mecca, and there should be, because according to the narrative, Muhammad conquered the Hijaz, and then he set up an empire that was led by his four friends, or who were his closest companions, who was Islamically motivated to spread the word of Islam. These people who were supposedly going out there to tell the world about the Quran and Muhammad and God's revelation to them. And they set up this huge Arab empire that goes from Libya to Afghanistan, and nobody mentions Muhammad, nobody mentions the Quran, and nobody mentions Mecca for a very long period of time.
Yeah.
And that's just not plausible.
Yeah.
So the narrative cannot be correct.
Yeah, I think the fact that there's such a long gap suggests that either the person was so unimportant that they didn't think it was important enough to write down, or there were earlier narratives that were simply scrubbed from history because it was problematic, and they wanted to update it because of a change in plan. So, for example, if as we think, Islam started further north and then they moved it further south, that required a huge change in the whole narrative, and it wouldn't have been just enough to basically relocate the events to a new location. They would have had to write different stories, because a story set in an arable northern area has got a different set of problems and conditions than somewhere set in the middle of a desert where there's very little water. One of the things that came up when I was researching into the Zamzam well was the fact that you have Queen Zubaydah, who went to Mecca in the latter end of the 8th century and realised that the pilgrims were suffering for lack of water. And so she spent the equivalent of €1 billion in their money of the day, creating a couple of aqueducts to ferry the water there. That, to me, also cuts into the general narrative that this couldn't have been the mother of all cities if that late in the day they had to actually get water there because of a scarcity of it.
No, it's ridiculous. And the Quran says many times, it exhorts its audience that to look around for signs of God, and the signs of God that it points to are closely packed fields of grain and fruit like grapes and figs and pomegranates, and their cattle that they take out to pasture, and they admire how beautiful their cattle are, and perhaps most striking of all, water that he sends down in abundance.
Yeah.
Well, it's a very ambitious argument if you're a preacher in one of the most arid places on earth, to tell the people that the sign that you're telling the truth is the fact that there's water in abundance.
Yeah,
It just simply doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I think one of the big giveaways for me is the reference to the Valley of Baca. Now, there is a Valley of Baca that is very close to Damascus, and I think that's kind of a bit suspicious, considering that's where the Umayyads set up their capital. A.J. Juice suggests that the word Umayyad may be linked to a word which means I forgot, Aramaic. Sorry, my mind went blank there. So there's a lot pointing north. There's also the script. Lots of scholars suggest that the script was influenced by Aramaic, and it borrowed a lot of the language, the sources, the stories from up north. What are your thoughts on that side of things?
Yes, I think it's generally accepted that the Quran is the first major work of literature written down in the Arabic language. We don't know exactly about these supposedly pre-Quran poems because we can't certain nobody wrote them down. Yeah. But the Quran is the first major piece of literature to be written down, and that's a huge challenge for whoever wrote it. To be the first person to write down a document in a language is a heck of a thing. Yeah,
I think that brings up.
And if I could just just complete my thought, but the themes, but there was a very well-established body of literature in Aramaic on religious matters, on exactly the same matters that the Quran author wanted to talk about God and the Bible stories and the last day and so on. So everything that he said would have related to matters about which there was already a huge body of literature in Aramaic. So it's not at all surprising that he would borrow Aramaic words and phrases, because these would have been not the lingua franca, they'd been the lingua Aramaic.
Aramaic. I think one of the areas of difference that myself and Paul would have is in relation to the person of Muhammad. Now, I have looked into Stephen Shoemaker's early sources. For me, I felt it didn't hinge together very well. I found that there was an awful lot of contradictions, conflicts, things that just wouldn't fit, strange things that shouldn't have happened, like for example the idea that Muhammad died in 632 when the Thomas the Presbyter source would actually suggest that he's really only starting his mission in 634, 2 years later. There's also an implication that perhaps Muhammad is Umar as well, but just tell our viewers what's your take on the issue of Muhammad and the Quran and so forth, because it would be different. I'd say it's fair to say it would be quite a different take to that of Odin, who believes that it was a group of preachers led by maybe a master preacher, but you've kind of a different take on it.
I see, when I started reading the Quran, it seemed to me absolutely obvious, self-evident that one person couldn't have written all this. The sort of person who wrote the short surahs at the end, they seemed completely different to the long surahs near the beginning. But over time, as I've read it in analysis, I feel I understand the person's style, and I can see how it developed over time. And he started preaching to one audience and ended up preaching to a completely different audience. And he started off as a doomsday merchant, telling people that the last day is about to come and people were to repent and turn to him. And he ends up leading an army and being very strategic. So it's a remarkable life, but it's not impossible that someone could have made that transition.
Yeah. I would say that one of the dangers with that is that when you are faced with an incongruence in a book, for example, and where the evidence might suggest multiple authors, if you spend enough time looking for patterns, you'll eventually find patterns. That's one of the doubts I have about your point of view, that maybe it's a result of years and years of looking at it, but the obvious first impression would be the opposite, which is the idea that it's inconsistent in terms of its style, in a way that you typically wouldn't find in a book that has been written by the same author. So how would you respond to that?
Gabriel Said Reynolds recently published an article on the doublets in the Quran, showing how often the same words and phrases appear in different surahs that seem to be quite unrelated, not just in their subject matter but in their styles. So he does actually, there are some points of commonality. The Quran author seems very fond of puns. He likes wordplay. He likes something called polyptotons, A polyptoton is where you get a word that is repeated in a different form. So, for example, in the Bible has many, but in the Bible they're almost all singles and plurals. So you talk about the Holy of Holies, or the Lord of Lords and King of Kings, or Vanity of Vanities, and so on. In the Quran, it tends to be nouns and verbs. So it talks about something, the shaker shakes, and the breaker breaks, and somebody is the second of two, or the third of three. And there's a lot of this, and of course the most famous one is Al-Rahman Al-Rahim. He loves this repetition of the word slightly changed, and that's a pattern that goes right from the very early short surahs right through to the late, more prosaic surahs.
But I would say, to challenge that, you can have a house style in a community of writers that they all follow. It's basically you agree on some common phrases, and then you just replicate them at will. How would you respond to that? Like, it's not. I wouldn't say it's a perfect proof of single authorship. I'd say that could be easily replicated if there was an agreed upon style, and there is like a phraseology that's repeated by the authors to kind of give a coherence. And also, the other thing is, a later editor can smooth out the differences across different texts by for example, introducing rhyming couplets to smooth out the jagged edges between different documents.
Yes, I don't dispute. I wasn't there. I don't dispute that there could have been a little workshop that Muhammad may have had a team. He might have been the editor-in-chief, and there might have been a little team of people working on different parts of different surahs, maybe at the same time. Although my experience, I don't know your experience, is it's actually very difficult to get people to write together. If you're an editor of a magazine, you can commission different authors, but to get people to work together and then create poetry by a committee is, I think, something rather difficult. But it is possible that he had other people helping him, and he was the editor-in-chief. It's perfectly feasible. One thing I would say is that towards the end of the Quran, the one person is very much dominant, because this again and again it talks about Allah and his messenger. And on some occasions the messenger seems more important than Allah, and there's very much a focus on one person, and it's all do what Allah's messenger says. There is this focus on a one single prophet or prophet figure. So I would say there's no sign that it's a collective.
Yeah.
In that.
I'm going to challenge you on that part, because I think a very obvious sign for me that there's different authors writing for different contexts to different people, which is the change in pronouns. So sometimes it's I, sometimes it's we, sometimes it's you, sometimes it's he. That to me makes more sense when you have text coming from different groups of people rather than it being the one author. I'll accept there's a single author if the person is schizophrenic, but if the person isn't schizophrenic, I would suggest it's more likely a community. How do you respond to that one?
I think that's David Woods' theory, isn't it? David Woods thinks the guy's schizophrenic and has different personalities. The Jekyll and Hyde character.
We'll move on to a related topic, which is the issue of the biography of Muhammad. How much of the Hadith Sirah would you take seriously? That's probably a fair question.
About none.
About none. Okay.
Some of it might be true, but my background is in law, and in English law, if evidence is clearly unreliable, then you would just dismiss it from the case. You would say, I exclude this evidence as being inherently unreliable.
Yeah.
So if a witness is proven to have lied continuously, the judge could just say, well, just ignore this person.
I definitely think
it's got no evidential value. It doesn't mean that they couldn't be telling the truth about one thing, but you can't rely upon it.
It's unusable, it's inadmissible. That's something I would agree with.
There is one thing I accept though, and that is the what they call the Constitution of Medina, because the Constitution of Medina just does not fit the narrative. There are several versions of it which are all more or less the same. But if you were writing something to fit into the narrative, you wouldn't write that. None of the tribes, the Jewish tribes that Muhammad expels or kills, none of those are mentioned in this document, even though the supposed justification of Muhammad attacking them was that they breached their treaty obligations. No one would have written a treaty that left them out. And the various other parts of it, it talks about the Muslims so it talks about the believers and the Muslims, which most people would say, well, believers and Muslims are the same thing, aren't they? I find that quite significant. The people who really believe and the people who submit are actually treated as two different groups.
Yeah,
so I tend to think that the Constitution of Medina is legit.
Yeah, I wouldn't even say I'm on the fence of that one. I remain highly sceptical of it, simply because it's suggestive that there was more things organised and developed at such an early stage, when all the other evidence points to a very late, slow development of everything. I think personally it emerged out of a Jewish-Christian milieu that basically went ever more heretical. I think the police are coming to take us away, Paul.
Yeah, blasphemy. London's finest and bravest on their way to. Another reason why I do find the Constitution somewhat plausible. Now distracted by the police. I can't remember what it was. It wasn't a good reason.
Another reason why you find the Constitution convincing.
Yes, well, mine's gone. I'll come back to it. There is a good other reason, so compelling that I can't remember it.
Yeah. So we've looked at the issue of Mecca, we've looked at the Quran, we've looked at the Hadiths. There's the issue of the Sirah we haven't really dealt with the Sirah all that much, but I know that it's going to be coming up later in the year, particularly with Lloyd de Jong, who has got evidence to suggest that there are 50 plus different Sirahs, and I think it would be absolutely fascinating to explore what sort of biographies are contained in each of them, and how similar are they, or even more importantly, how different are they? And I think that could be quite an insight. And the question of why they chose one Sirah out of many is an important question, and also why it connects with why they chose one Quran out of many Arabic Qurans as well, and why is that considered more reliable, or was it just an arbitrary choice? But
it's very telling that they don't write. This huge empire supposedly spread the word of Islam and tell everybody about God's last prophet and his message that everyone is supposed to, and we're led to believe this was an Islamic empire there to spread the word of Islam, and yet nobody writes the life of Muhammad for something like 130 years until Ibn Ishaq writes the life of Muhammad. But then that's okay. That's rather. Except, well, maybe they're not a bookish sort of people. These are not people who like reading and writing books very much. It took them 130 years to write the biography of their prophet. But then, what's really telling is they seem to make different versions of this. They seem to make about a dozen or so different copies of Ibn Ishaq's manuscript, and not one of them has survived.
Yeah,
not one of them is anywhere, and this isn't unreasonable to expect that they would have survived, because this would have been a hugely important document. You would have put this in a palace, and it would have been guarded, and it would have been regarded as a treasure.
Yeah.
And if you made a dozen of them, each one of them would be regarded as hugely important.
Yeah.
You'd have thought there'd be one in Damascus, one in Jerusalem, one in Tessabon, and not they've all disappeared, and nobody knows what happened to them.
Yeah.
And the next thing, the earliest thing we actually have is Ibn Hisham writing his redacted version,
Yeah.
in which he says, I've left out some things that are too painful to remember.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, you see, I
so
think
they've obviously been destroyed. The
yeah.
original
Well,
ones.
if we can trust even the fact that there was an Ibn Ishaq that did write one, because again, we have no proof without the actual document surviving. It's hard to know. But the other thing is, it's interesting that Ibn Hisham's Sirah comes out just about 20 years after the aqueducts were built in Mecca, without which they could have even told a story in Mecca. So in order to tell a story convincingly of a life way down in Mecca, you first of all have to get the water set up. So I think there's a good old chance that the story that they had originally under Ibn Ishaq was either located somewhere else, perhaps even Jerusalem. Who knows?
We have that's it. Obviously, going back to my my legal background,
Yeah.
it's taken them a little while to get the story straight.
Yeah. That's always very suspicious.
Putting it mildly, about 200 years to
Yeah.
really get a story that they're prepared to stick with, and then get rid of all the early drafts.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
yes, that's about 200 years to to explain all the bits in the Quran that they need to explain
Yeah.
to get the story down
Yeah.
to. Oh, by the way, I've remembered my point about the. About the Constitution of Medina.
Yeah.
Yes, it talks about the. It mentions the different tribes, and these are apparently Arab tribes. And then it talks about the Jews of this tribe, and the Jews of that tribe, and the Jews of another tribe, and that reads very unnaturally. You would have thought that there would be one or more Jewish tribes, that the tribes would have an independent Jewish identity. You wouldn't have expected there to be Jews in one tribe and Jews in another tribe and Jews in another, but the tribes themselves are not Jewish. That seems a strange and an odd arrangement, and yet that is precisely what Sebios tells us happened, because Sebios tells us that when the Jews came out of Edessa and Muhammad formed them into an army, he divided them amongst the Arab tribes. So that's exactly, even though there's no reason to think that Sebios had seen the Constitution of Medina, or that whoever wrote the Constitution of Medina had any idea who Sebios was, the two actually corroborate one another,
Yeah.
in my opinion.
Yeah. I think one of the topics I'd like to talk with you, if you're okay with it, is the idea that in the early centuries there was a strong Jewish flavour to Islam.
Oh yes, no.
That Q, your piece of evidence.
Q.
Yeah, because you see, Paul has got a very significant piece of evidence that backs up the idea that there's a massive hole in the standard Islamic narrative, and he very casually divulged this with me yesterday over dinner and a few beers, and I thought it'd be a good idea to get to share it with you.
Well, as you know, Mel, and some of the viewers may know, my big idea is what I call the Jerusalem thesis.
Yeah.
The idea that we found all these holes in the narrative, and we can now start filling in the holes, and we can now start filling in some of the gaps. And I think that a lot of the Quran, whenever the Quran refers to the Masjid al-Haram, the sacred place of prostration, it is talking about Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And I've recently published an article. It's on the academia.edu website. So if you look in academia.edu and look for Jerusalem, City of Islam by Paul Ellis, hopefully you'll find it. It's very, very long. It's about 100 pages long.
Yeah. Well worth the read.
Oh, I totted up the arguments. I've come up with 25 independent, standalone arguments.
Fantastic.
as to why the Masjid al-Haram
But Paul,
has to be Jerusalem.
But Paul, you're only speculating.
No, I've got solid evidence that you can hold in your hand, and indeed which I am holding in my hand.
Yes. Tell me about this coin you've got.
This is a coin. I bought it from a coin dealer on the internet. It describes itself as an Umayyad fals. That's a fals is a copper sort of coin, and the coin people I bought it from estimate that it was created in 78 to 85 years after of the Islamic calendar, the Arab calendar.
So that would be the late 7th century. No, sorry, the late. Which is it? Late 7th century, early 8th century.
Yes, I'd 22 years and maybe take 1 or 2 off, I'm not sure.
So 690s to the 710s roughly.
Yes, it could have been round about the time of Abd al-Malik. Yes, it could have been one of Abd al-Malik's servants.
Now, tell us about the coin. I've got to zoom in there of the general shape of it.
Can we see it?
Yeah.
Okay, well, it has a menorah. That is the Jewish branched candlestick.
Yeah.
Now, the actual biblical menorah, the menorah that existed in the temple, had 7 branches, and there are 7 branch candlesticks on coins. I haven't got one of those. This is one of the later ones. Later on, they created coins with a 5-branch candlestick. But it is nevertheless, I think, clearly identifiable as a Jewish menorah. And around it is an Arabic motto, which is, there is no God but Allah. So, and you can see the word Allah in Arabic letters right above the Jewish menorah.
That is explosive stuff. So you're let me get this right. You're saying there is a Jewish symbol in association with the Shahada on a coin from the Umayyad time.
I'm saying that in the time of Abd al-Malik, he minted coins and he wanted to symbolize his rule, and the symbol that he chose for his rule was the menorah. Wow.
That's quite a bombshell, and I'm sure everyone who's watching now will be super excited with that revelation.
Real hard evidence. And I don't think necessarily, I wouldn't get too hung up on the idea that it's a Jewish symbol.
Yeah.
It seems to me that it's a symbol of the Jerusalem temple. It is what Muhammad, I think, or what the Quran author, who I call Muhammad, it was after capturing the Masjid al-Haram.
Yeah.
It was after capturing the Jerusalem temple. His people did capture the Jerusalem temple, and they wanted a symbol to represent the Jerusalem temple. The menorah in the book of Exodus is created to accompany the Ark of the Covenant in the tabernacle in the wilderness, and it is then moved into the temple when the temple is built by Solomon. And it is a symbol of the temple and a symbol of the Israelite people. So I think that is what it is symbolizing: hard, solid evidence of the Jerusalem thesis.
Yeah.
And if there are any Muslim viewers out there who want to try and find me a coin from the 7th century with an Arabic Quranic motto and with a picture of the Kaaba on, I'd love to hear it. I'd love to hear from you, because there's absolutely no reference to the Kaaba, no cubes here. This is what Abd al-Malik thought was important.
And what's interesting is we don't have any equivalent for Petra. This is very much focused on Jerusalem. This is what they are considering to be important. And we were talking about this last night, and you were saying that, Jerusalem was the place for the Arabs in the 7th century. That was the place they wanted to conquer.
Well, for everyone.
Yeah.
Look at any maps. The Jerusalem is the centre. There was a tradition in both Judaism and later on in Christianity, but of course developed from Judaism. There's this tradition that Jerusalem is the navel, the ophthalmos of the world. And there's this book which I was reading a little while back, The Cave of Treasures. I don't know if that's 3rd century. But the Cave of Treasures tries to fill in the gaps a little bit, and tries to explain that Adam and Eve came down in this cave, and Noah lived in the cave, and Cain and Abel lived in the cave, and everyone lived in this cave, and that becomes Jerusalem. That cave is finally revealed as being Jerusalem, or being in Jerusalem. It says that this Golgotha is where Jesus was crucified, on this very spot. And this book, though Jerusalem is obviously very important to the Bible in the Bible's own terms, but whoever wrote The Cave of Treasures wasn't happy with that. He wanted to go back and link the Jerusalem even to people like Noah and Adam and Eve, who didn't have any particular connection to Jerusalem in the Bible. And the Cave of... Why am I telling you all this? Because the Cave of Treasures, we know, was cited in the Quran. The Cave of Treasures has the story of the angels bowing to Adam and Iblis refusing, and even the word, if one looks at the word, is that Iblis says in the Quran to justify not bowing to Adam. He says, "He is made of clay and I am made of fire." These are the words that come from the Cave of Treasures. So we know that the Quran author was reading the Cave of Treasures because the same wording come in. And the Cave of Treasures is all about Jerusalem.
But that Cave of Treasures book was not written in Arabic. What book?
No, that would have been, I guess it would be Aramaic.
Yeah, so there we go. Obviously, whoever is writing the Quran is familiar with Aramaic. Highly unlikely, I would have thought, way down in Mecca. Not impossible, but highly unlikely that they would have a library of all of these books way down there, and also that they're speaking that language, because it's really up in the north, in Syria and Iraq and Persia is where Aramaic is primarily being spoken.
I think we can dismiss out of hand the idea that Muhammad was some illiterate, as David Woods would say, an illiterate caravan robber and paedophile and history's most obvious false prophet. I don't think he was. I think he must have been extraordinarily erudite. He seems to have read Jewish texts, the Bible, the Hebrew Bible. He knew about the Book of Enoch. He knew about the Cave of Treasures. He knew the Talmud. He knew Mishnah. He seems to have soaked up information from everywhere.
It sounds like you're suggesting that the standard Islamic narrative is the most obvious false narrative in the world.
That's more to the point.